The global financial landscape is shifting faster than many expected. What began as quiet adjustments in trade and currency strategy has now evolved into a broad, coordinated movement away from the US dollar. For years, the discussion around de-dollarization focused mainly on the BRICS nations. Russia began selling oil and gas in rubles. China developed alternative currency systems to reduce dependence on the dollar. Across the global south, central banks steadily increased their gold reserves while cutting their exposure to US treasuries. But the latest development goes beyond that. Even Washington's closest partners are beginning to diversify, and that is deeply troubling for US policymakers. Australia, one of America's most important allies and one of the world's largest commodity exporters, is gradually moving towards settlements outside the dollar system. Major Australian corporations are adapting to this new reality, responding to both economic incentives and geopolitical trends. China, recognizing the opportunity, is accelerating this process. The scale of Chinese demand for raw materials is extraordinary, particularly in iron ore. Each month, China imports over 100 million tons of the commodity, accounting for nearly 3/4 of the global market. This level of consumption gives Beijing enormous leverage. If China reduces its purchases, prices collapse. If it increases them, prices surge. For suppliers like Australia and Brazil, this demand is a lifeline. And for China, it is a source of power. With such influence, Beijing can set terms in ways that mirror Washington's own past tactics. Where the United States once used tariffs and sanctions to shape global trade behavior, China is now using its purchasing power to push forward its own economic agenda, including the expansion of trade denominated in the Chinese yuan. The most significant step so far is the agreement between China and Australia to settle a large portion of their iron ore trade in yuan rather than dollars. This arrangement is more than a transaction. It is a strategic trial run for a much broader financial shift. For Beijing, the logic is clear. Paying for essential imports like iron ore in its own currency eliminates exposure to dollar fluctuations, reduces the need for US foreign reserves, and helps internationalize the yuan. The deal with BHP, Australia's largest mining company, covers roughly 30% of the company's iron ore sales to China, worth an estimated $10 billion and involving nearly 90 million tons of material. Instead of dollars flowing from Beijing to Sydney, those payments will now be made in yuan. And for BHP, the simplest path will be to reinvest that currency directly into Chinese projects and suppliers. The implications for the United States are serious. Reduced use of the dollar in major global transactions weakens overall demand for US currency. If other nations follow suit, the incentive to hold large reserves of dollars will decline. At the same time, the yuan becomes more relevant internationally as China expands its role as both a producer and a consumer in global markets. This process is already spreading. In the ongoing trade tensions between the US and China, Beijing's growing economic importance gives it new leverage. As the US cuts imports and countries turn more toward Chinese markets, the share of trade conducted in yuan will only expand. Already, around 30% of trade between China and Brazil is settled in yuan, and Australia is expected to move further in that direction. The trend doesn't stop with trade. Australia's resource companies are now borrowing directly in yuan as well. One of the country's largest miners recently secured a $2 billion equivalent loan denominated in the Chinese currency. The decision is part of a broader strategy to align with shifting financial realities. The loan structure highlights why these moves are attractive. It is unsecured, supported by major Chinese banks such as ICBC and the Bank of China, and carries minimal restrictions on how the funds can be used. Even more notable is the interest rate, just 3.8%. A figure that undercuts comparable borrowing costs in US dollars by a wide margin. If an Australian corporation were to raise funds in dollars through conventional channels, its rate would be tied to US Treasury yields, which have hovered around 4% or higher. In practice, that means borrowing costs of 5 to 6%, at least 30 to 50% higher than those offered under yuan-based financing. For global businesses managing billions in capital, that difference is decisive. The dollar, once considered the world's most stable financing option, has become increasingly expensive to borrow. The proceeds from these yuan loans are being directed into renewable energy and green industrial projects, sectors where China holds significant production advantages. Beijing has been strategically using such financing arrangements to strengthen its own industrial ecosystem, while binding foreign partners more closely to its supply networks. The mining firm's subsequent contracts with Chinese equipment suppliers illustrate this clearly. It recently signed a $400 million deal with XCMG, one of China's largest manufacturers, to purchase zero-emission heavy machinery. The UN-denominated loan will likely fund similar future deals, ensuring that Chinese manufacturers remain central to Australia's industrial transition. For the United States, these developments represent multiple points of pressure. The dollar's global dominance is being eroded, demand for US treasuries is softening, and the American industrial base continues to weaken. The problem is structural. The US economy is highly financialized, with limited domestic manufacturing capacity and rising borrowing costs. Meanwhile, competitors are offering cheaper credit, stronger trade incentives, and more flexible arrangements that reduce exposure to American monetary policy. Each step China takes toward expanding Yuan settlements adds momentum to this shift. The closer Beijing's economic ties become with major commodity producers like Australia, the faster de-dollarization gains ground. What once seemed like a distant possibility is now visible in official data and corporate transactions. Across the Asia-Pacific region, China is pursuing similar strategies, gradually strengthening its relationships with long-standing U.S. partners such as South Korea, Japan, and others. The broader pattern is unmistakable. Through trade, finance, and infrastructure, China is methodically building an alternative system that reduces reliance on the dollar while increasing the appeal of its own currency. The United States, for decades the anchor of global finance, now faces a reality in which influence is no longer guaranteed. The transition will not happen overnight, but the trajectory is clear. The foundations of dollar dominance are being tested, and the world's economic center of gravity is slowly shifting eastward. Across the world, countries are walking a tightrope, recognizing the rise of a new power while still trying to keep the old one satisfied. It's a dangerous balancing act, but everyone knows it has to be done. The global game demands it. On one side stands Washington, unpredictable and volatile. On the other, Beijing, steady, calculated, and increasingly impossible to ignore. In South Korea, that tension is becoming harder to manage. Tariffs that once stood at 25% have eased to around 15%. But no one can predict what will happen next. 1 week's trade policy can vanish overnight with a single presidential tweet or executive order. If Trump changes direction again, Korean exports to the U.S. could crash in a matter of days. Uncertainty has become the only certainty. America's trade policy shifts faster than the wind, and for a country like South Korea, whose survival depends on global exports, that volatility is dangerous. Today, Korea's economic lifeline runs through China more than ever before. The tariff war has pushed its imports of Chinese goods through the roof, and the trade deficit keeps widening. At the same time, Korean exports to China have stalled, particularly in the auto sector. Once Korean cars filled Chinese streets, now sales have collapsed. Seoul knows it must find a way to repair its relationship with Beijing, because the future is being written in a world that looks nothing like the old one. A massive share of Korea's exports comes from one place: semiconductors. The chips that power everything from phones to AI systems are still led by Samsung and SK Hynix. But that dominance is being tested. China is rapidly climbing the technological ladder, closing gaps that once looked impossible to bridge. In AI and memory chips, the distance between Chinese and US tech is narrowing fast, and Korea is caught in the middle. The message is clear: better to build bridges now than face the storm alone when the wave finally hits. Meanwhile, on the geopolitical stage, another storm brews. This one over energy. In just the last week, Trump's administration sanctioned Russia's largest oil producers, warning that any country doing business with them could face punishment. Yet when Trump met with Xi, not a single word was said about China cutting back on Russian oil. Because the truth is simple: America can't make Beijing walk away from cheap crude. India isn't budging either. Its refineries continue to import Russian oil because they have no real alternative. Russian crude now trades at an 8 or 12 discount compared to Brent, and global prices have jumped more than 10% since the sanctions hit. Every nation on earth is feeling that pain, India included. Since 2023, Russia has been India's #1 oil supplier, providing more than 30% of its total imports. That cheap energy has powered India's industries and kept inflation under control. If New Delhi suddenly obeyed Washington and turned off that supply, it would be disastrous. China would scoop up the excess barrels at an even cheaper price, while India would be forced to buy higher-cost American oil. Prices would rise, industries would suffer, and Indian exports would lose their competitive edge. Slowly, the country would become more dependent on U.S. markets, giving Washington more leverage than ever before. That's how sanctions work beneath the surface, not as punishment for one nation, but as a chain reaction that reshapes entire economies. And just as predicted, the global whack-a-mole game has already begun. BRICS nations aren't letting go of cheap oil, and they're not turning their backs on Russia, because they understand something vital. Today it might be Moscow under fire, but tomorrow it could be them. According to Reuters, Indian refiners are still purchasing Russian oil scheduled for December delivery, working through non-sanctioned companies. It's the same story we saw during the Biden-era restrictions. Whenever Washington slaps sanctions on Moscow, new firms emerge overnight, fresh names, new entities, and independent traders who keep the oil flowing. Shadow fleets, hidden tankers, and backdoor deals make the global market almost impossible to control. There's too much money at stake. As long as there's profit in moving barrels, traders will find a way to move them. You can't shut down an oil giant like Russia without massive consequences. Arbitrage always finds a path. So why is America still pushing so hard to punish Russia? Trump says it's about ending the war in Ukraine. Maybe that's partly true, but there's another motive hiding underneath: selling U.S. oil. In August, American crude output reached a record-breaking 13.8 million barrels a day, even higher than industry forecasts. But here's the issue. When production keeps climbing and foreign demand drops, the US ends up sitting on a mountain of unsold oil. Storage costs rise, profits vanish, and producers start to panic. By squeezing Russia's exports, the US creates fear in the market, and fear drives demand toward American barrels. If your rivals can't sell, you become the only option left. It's classic strategy. Limit your competitor, and you control the price. But this time, it's not working as planned. BRICS nations, from China to India, Brazil to South Africa, aren't buying into the narrative. They're still taking in Russian crude, keeping trade alive through new routes and alternative systems. The message is clear. Washington's oil weapon no longer has the same bite. The world has changed. The players have changed. The networks of trade and trust are shifting under everyone's feet. Countries are learning to adapt, to maneuver between powers without becoming pawns in the process. The balance that once seemed fixed is now fluid, and those who fail to adjust will be left behind. So, the question remains. Will nations like Australia and other resource-rich economies continue to move away from dollar dominance? Have these sanctions already begun to backfire? The signs are everywhere, from Asian ports to African refineries. The old order is cracking. What's unfolding right now isn't just a trade dispute or a diplomatic spat. It's a slow, seismic shift in global power, one that's rewriting the rules of energy, influence, and independence. Stay sharp, stay curious, and keep watching, because the story isn't over yet. It's only just beginning.